Welcome to Walking in Victory. This is your host, Sean Moreno. Walking on Victory is just a show here where we love to have people come on and share their stories. We love to hear about the testimonies of believers. I believe that it provides a lot of value for people to hear people's stories and see how God has transformed them through the power of the Spirit and through the Word. And so we love to have people on to share stories, and then we also love to just to provide value for you guys with principles to take away from the conversations that we have. So, thank you for joining us today for Walking in Victory. Today, I have a really cool guest. She's someone that I've actually known for 5 years now, which is kind of hard to believe. But she's great. She is a chiropractor, so she helps me feel better on a every other week basis. And she's just been someone that I've really enjoyed talking to and I look up to. She is a business owner as well, and she is a woman of God. So today I have on the show with me Dr. Laura Piehl.
Thank you.
How are you?
Good. And Sean, when you asked me to do this, if you remember, I kind of thought you were joking.
Yeah.
So
yeah, this is something that's still new for me too, as podcasting and having having conversations honestly isn't new. This is like something that I really enjoy doing. So,
and what we do like most of the time at your adjustment.
Exactly.
Anyway.
We just talk and we talk about the Lord and we talk about just how things are going. So we're here. And
the only difference is a microphone. And I have to warn you, I do announcements at church. And sometimes when you get a microphone in front of you, it's like open mic night. You just never know.
Sure. So you're used to it being in front of, some audio.
Yeah.
That's okay. Yeah. So as I said earlier, we love having people come on and share their stories, and we love to see how God has transformed people, because he's obviously transformed you, he's transformed me, and anyone who's a Christian has seen that transformation. So we'd love for you to share your testimony, starting with your childhood and go from there. Yeah.
So I used to be really self-conscious about my testimony because I never felt like it was good or like, oh my goodness, that is just, you hear some testimonies where you're like, that is amazing how God brought you from total death to total life. But I know that happened in me, even though it doesn't feel as like wow factor. But I can't remember a time when I didn't feel like I was a Christian. So just grew up in church. I was painfully shy. So I don't ever feel like I had the experience where I went to kids' church because I would just beg my parents to let me sit with them in normal, like big person church. Which was actually, I don't think there's anything wrong with that necessarily, but I can remember listening to sermons and thinking like, wow, I'm supposed to honor my parents and just things like that. But I don't think it was until I was in 7th grade, I had the opportunity to grow up in a really small kind of conservative area where we were able to have this Bible class that you could opt into over your lunch period. When I heard the gospel like laid out and said like, you have to make a decision to ask God to come into your heart. And I was like, what? Why did I not know this? So I did that because I was like, yeah, well, I already thought I had that. So that would be the time where I would say like, I prayed a prayer to ask, Jesus to be my Savior. And then I'd say it was a journey of like actually allowing him to be the Lord over my life. And so I got baptized when I was 16. And I don't know if it was like this deep desire for baptism or just more of like, this is a next step. And that's also something that I'm always like, oh man, I love those baptism stories where people, you know what I mean? I don't know. It's not about me. And then I would say, yeah. And then in college would be the first time where, I grew up very sheltered, I would say as well, where I actually felt like, okay, my faith is becoming my own. And college was a very isolating time for me because my eyes were just open to this whole other like world and way of living that I knew is not how I was raised. And some of that was not what I knew God was calling, Christians to. And so I don't think I always handled it the best because I would be like the best Pharisee ever because I'm like a natural rule follower and just feeling like, and I think during that time I felt isolated and I felt God met me in that. Like I can just remember being in my dorm room, not doing certain things, but I also think I didn't handle it the best because I'm sure that my teammates or classmates would have thought like, she's righteous or a little self-righteous or maybe judgmental. So that's a period of time where I felt like there was a lot of growth, but also definitely not perfection in that.
And in high school, did you feel like you were surrounded by like a lot of non-believers? Were you at a Christian?
Not a Christian school, but just a small town, large Mennonite like presence. And so it would have definitely been the norm for or it wouldn't have been the norm for someone to say that they weren't a believer. Yeah.
That's interesting because I think for me, in high school especially, I didn't know anybody who was a Christian. And I knew people that would go to like Catholic school or not Catholic school, but even just Catholic church. Like I'd go to St. Joe's or wherever I was going. And I knew people that would go there and I would see them at high school. But to have conversations about the Lord in high school were just like, was unheard of. I might have had conversations with people of like, God obviously exists because look at the sun and look at the stars and the moon. And like, that's just very obvious. But like, that's very different of like just being raised and you like had a desire to be with the Lord. In high school, people were, also, hey, I'm a Christian too, and that was pretty normal. But then you said you got to college and you started to see a couple things that were not of the Lord, right? And you said you would kind of stay in your dorm rooms rather than.
Well, I felt I was in college to do a job, and that was to get a degree and to do my best because I was a basketball player. So all of the other stuff just felt frivolous to me. And I'm very competitive. So this is like where you can see like, oh, that was not healthy. Like when people were doing other things, I looked at like, instead of being heartbroken, it's like, well, great, I get a leg up because, I got a great night's sleep. I'm not doing all those things. And so for me, I was just very business-like in my approach to school. So that wasn't a lure for me just because I knew that it would be a distraction from my purpose there. But yeah, so I'm saying like, I don't know if I was a great example or an evangelist in that season. I was more so shocked to probably disgusted at some things. And I didn't use that opportunity, like for maybe God to speak through me the way that I would have loved to.
Yeah, but maybe you showed it in your actions.
Yeah, maybe.
And the way you
yeah.
carry yourself on the basketball
I would
court.
hope. Yeah, I would hope. But I also, you just reflect on seasons where you're like, that was probably a missed opportunity. But God was growing me in other ways.
Sure. There's grace. There's always grace for that. Sure. And like there's a purpose for that. So that's cool. And you played basketball in college now, in high school, and actually growing up, right? When did you start playing basketball?
My dad was a high school basketball coach. So I mean, we have pictures from me like as a baby with the, form and shooting on a little thing. So my first year of AAU was in second grade and my parents sacrificed so much. I scored one basket the entire season, which was probably like 12 tournaments, So, yeah, so it was just part of who I was since, really I can remember as well.
Yeah. And even though you started off maybe not being the greatest, you still were stuck to it, and you played in middle school and you played in high school. Yeah. And you were obviously good enough to go play in college too. Sure. And what university did you go to?
I went to the University of Findlay.
Go.
Yeah, right. Yeah. To be fair, they have a really dominant men's program and the women's program has kind of like had peaks and valleys, but it was a really good fit because it allowed me to have the balance of pursuing the schooling that I wanted and still getting to play a sport that I loved, and was a huge blessing to, have them help me pay for my school as well.
That's a blessing. So speaking of basketball, what did God teach you the most in the sport of basketball as you played, especially in college too?
Yeah. I think there's so many great lessons, of course, like it's hard to whittle them all down, but I think a main takeaway is where do you place your identity? And it kind of leads into how my career ended, but God gives us gifts, and then it's so easy to take a good gift and then like morph it into something that it wasn't made to be. And so I think I learned God gives us these gifts, and then it's our responsibility to develop that skill and talent. And so that's something I think was a really good thing, that like, why not extract every potential that you have out of the innate gifts that God's given you? So that was a high point of that. Another low of that could be that, wow, you can take something intended for good and wrap your identity up in something other than Christ. And then when it goes south, then you're left, scrambling and figuring out, what is this now?
Yeah, well, you had to have that conversation with yourself, right? Because you sustained a couple of injuries, right?
I tore my ACL twice.
Yeah.
Yes. And so that was not only physically painful, and just, after the first one, it was like a 7-month recovery, surgery and all these things. And then I did it like the very next time I played. So it was just disappointing. But I'm such a competitor and wanted to like prove that this isn't going to hold me back. That it was also a challenge in a way. So it was a hard season, but also challenging in a good way too. But yeah, I had to wrestle with my role has changed. I used to just be able to work as hard as I wanted and then get the results that I wanted. And I would say that was the first time where there was no correlation with how hard I worked and the direct fruit of like points or minutes or whatever that looked like. And so that was humbling. But I also felt that God was very near to me in that season. And I can just remember, so after the second surgery and rehab, I got cleared in January of my senior year. So this is my 5th year because I took a medical redshirt year. And it was my first game that I was cleared. And I had went from starting every game that I had played at Finley. And here I am, like there's 6 minutes to go in the game. And you're like, wow, this is what this feels like to like, I'm at practice, like working really hard, waiting for your name to be called up. And like, what a humbling experience. But I just remember my coach said like, Lord, the game was clearly at hand. Like I'm going in for those minutes of the game before where it would have been like, oh, thankfully I get 6 minutes to rest, at the end of the game. Well, here's my time to shine. I just remember sitting there waiting to check in and just almost being overcome by like, wow, God, thank you. Like, thank you for bringing me to this point where I wanted to get out on the floor again. And like, I did that. Like, thank you for your faithfulness in that, even though I airballed a free throw. I don't know if I've shared that with you. Yeah, I got fouled and then I airballed a free throw and I'm like, wow, this is, this is, yeah, but it was also a season where I felt like I was wrestling with this concept of like, how do we define goodness? There was like a very well-meaning family friend that when I tore my ACL a couple times just was like, God wants you to be healed and whole, and yeah, things that are super true. And also like, this is the devil, like, trying to derail you. And, there might be truth that there was, the devil doesn't want good things for us. But I just remember like thinking, well, what is good? Because right now this doesn't necessarily feel good, but like, could this be good in the end? And so that's like the first time where those seeds were planted on like, well, does good mean health? Like, does goodness mean points? Yeah. Yeah. And so I think that was something God had taught me in that season too. Like, just because doesn't feel good right now doesn't mean that it won't be really good in the end. Yeah. And I just feel like, man, if like the Lord blesses me with children one day, had I not have had that experience, it could have been very easy for me to feel like just work harder. Because if you work harder, you can be whatever you want to be. But the reality is that there are limitations to that. And I don't think I ever would have been able to wrap my mind around it in that.
I feel like, the Bible says like we reap what we sow, which there's definitely truth to that. But at the same time, as human beings, we always want to perform. We always want to say, well, I put this amount of work in, therefore I deserve this equal amount of reward back, right? But life doesn't always work that way. And it's funny because the gospel itself doesn't work that way. We don't perform and earn brownie points with God. And if we outperform others, we're rewarded, God does give us good gifts for the things we do for him, but God is more concerned about why we're doing those things rather than, oh, I'm doing these things out of obligation, right? The gospel doesn't even work that way. It's actually he did the work for us already on the cross, and there's nothing we can do to earn that. Only by humility. It says to become like a little child, actually, is the only way you can enter the kingdom of heaven. And so I think as human beings, maybe because of the fall, we have this inherent nature to want to prove ourselves and to perform and to earn. Like we work every week, right? We earn our wages by how many hours we work at times, right? But it's like, no, Jesus has already earned that for us. And it's just, I always use this analogy too of like being married to somebody. It's like, well, if you're married to someone, you don't necessarily do good things to earn their favor because you're already married, right? You do things because you are married. You do nice things and you do good things for that person because you love them, right? And so I can tell that like God definitely worked in your life and helped you learn that lesson through. It's always through like trial too. It's never through like something great. Like James chapter 1 says, consider it all joy, when you fall into various trials, because the testing of your faith produces patience or perseverance, right? And so that's how it works in the world too, is we learn through trials and through failures and things not going the way that we want them to go. And you wouldn't be the same person you are today if you didn't go through what you went through, right?
For sure. So that's where I feel like that was a good thing. Like it was a good season. It was hard. It maybe derailed some of the goals that I had, but Brad interrupting us. But but it's still a really, I think, when I reflect on my life, that was a blessing.
Yeah, you couldn't say that at the moment. You're like, oh, but that's the thing is like our feelings can overtake us rather than the truth of what's going on. Actually, this is a side note. I gave a message last night at the Dream Center about shame, and I didn't even really want to talk about it because I had to share things I didn't want to. I actually was being vulnerable and sharing things that I was going through about even just like my sexuality and all these kinds of things, and I had to put that out in the open, But I could do that because God has taken away my shame, right? He took that away, and I was telling people that your shame doesn't necessarily separate you from God. Because in the garden, Adam and Eve sinned, and the first thing God did was he went and found them, and he asked, where are you? He didn't run the opposite way. He actually went to them. And later on in that chapter, it says that he clothed them with tunics of skin. Like he covered their shame, right? And it's like, and I talked about all these things, but there was one guy who didn't like to hear it. He said, I walked in up here and now I'm feeling down here. And I said, and I think shame is honestly such a shameful thing to talk about. We're ashamed to talk about shame, right? It's even mentioning it can really bother somebody. And I felt like, like an instance, like I feel that I maybe said the wrong thing. But God immediately was like, no, you talked about how I want to walk in people's shame with them. And even though maybe someone didn't like to hear what I had to say, doesn't mean that it was wrong. And so when you said that made me think of that, by the way. So yeah. So we can't always trust our feelings. They're a good roadmap at times to point us to something maybe even bigger that we need to work on, but it's not something like this is the main thing I follow, sure. Right? And you learn that too as a basketball player. So yeah, so you were a Christian growing up, but then you had this moment where you're like, I need to make that personal decision, right? And then you did. And then you played basketball, and you had a couple injuries, and you learned a lot of things from those injuries. But then after college, after Oilers, you went to grad school for
chiropractic. So I was in Atlanta for 4 years, and for our first year, we attended First Baptist Atlanta. So we got to growing up, my mom always watched Dr. Charles Stanley in Touch Ministries. Yeah, so we attended his church for a year. Yeah, which was really special. My mom would come visit and she'd be so excited. I'm like, Mom, are you excited for Jesus or Dr. Stanley? And I'm pretty sure I know the yeah, but that was like an amazing experience where like every time you went there, it was like bring your Bible and bring a pen because like you don't just sit here. It was like you are writing notes, which was amazing. And I got to experience diversity in the church body that I hadn't had ever before. So it was a really beautiful time. We were probably the youngest people there, which wasn't an issue. But as time went on, we were looking for community, and the offerings that they had, things just didn't really work out with my grad school schedule. So Brad went with the Athletes in Actions trip to Israel for 3 weeks. And during that time, a lot of my friends at that time were going to Passion City Church with Louis Giglio. And I was like, well, Brad's gone. I'm just going to like, for 3 weeks, I'm going to go attend there. And we had started a series. And when Brad got back, I was like, hey, could we like see the series through and then we can figure out. And then it was just a really, we transitioned then to Passion City, which was a season of growth as well.
Yeah, in Atlanta. Yeah, I forgot that you actually lived in that area for a little while. And by the way, too, she's married to Brad, who was also a basketball player as well. How did you guys meet?
We met at Finley. He transferred in after my sophomore year, so I was going to be a junior. He was a year younger. He had played Division I at Robert Morris for a year and then transferred in. And we met, and became friends for a while. And then we ended up getting married before my 5th year and before his senior year. Yeah, so during school. Yeah.
Like the first time you ever saw Brad, like where was that?
On campus. In the summer, most students were gone, but we had to stay for basketball. So the men's team and women's team would be there. And to be honest, I was initially not super impressed. No, he knows. And I think the feeling was mutual because I was there, like, meeting people in the weight room. Like, I'm not a cute sweater. Like, I was just, yeah. And he had this air about him. He had went to a school that was, like, very just different. And he came and he had, like, a swag. And you know Brad. He was just different. And I was just like, I don't know about that guy. But then time went on and I was like, okay, we actually share very similar values, grew up in a very similar community, and then kind of saw through the initial impressions.
That's funny. That's funny. He grew on you a little bit. Yeah, that's good. That's good. And now you're married and been married for a little while.
Yeah, this year will be 10 years.
Time flies. Goodness. That's awesome. Congrats, by the way. And so you met Brad. You're in school, and then you graduate.
I did. Yeah, we graduated and decided to move back to Ohio because I had, at that time, my brother is 9 years younger than I am. He was a senior in high school. And I wanted to like be able to, I felt like I'd missed so much of his life because when I went to college, he was 10. And then I went for 5 years at Finley. And then I had 4 years in Atlanta. And then I was like, here's this person that I want to be part of, as much as I can.
For sure. And so you did, and you came back and you supported him well. But then you eventually opened up your own business.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right here in Dublin, we opened a chiropractic office, and that was great. It was just an hour and a half home. So I felt like I got to do a lot still with my family, but Brad and I had our own little thing here. So it was a really good fit.
Right. And what's crazy is like, I remember I used to go to, this is how I know you. It's like, I used to go to the hot yoga place down the way from your business. And I remember someone in there was like mentioned that they met you, and they're like, if you ever need chiropractic care, go see Dr. Laura. Like, she's great. And then I ended up like really like messing up my neck, like, which I still need to stop doing at times. After I get my adjustments, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna be good. And then I'll do a little one there, no. Anyway, but I just remember him saying that, and then I ended up hurting my neck. And then I was like, oh yeah, there's that place in Dublin that they mentioned. And I called, and I was like, it was actually like, like when you wake up bad, you strain your neck, like that type of thing. It's like, I probably look like this too, like a little bit off center, obviously. And I was like, can you guys get me in like today, and I think I did go in the same day, like maybe a few hours later. And I felt better. Um, and it was just great because I got to meet you, and we got to build a relationship. This is back in 2017, and this is 2022 now, so it's kind of hard to believe. But I remember like the beginning parts of your business, and I've seen it grow to what it is now, to where you have local businesses that you support. You have a flourishing business, right, with a lot of people coming in. And I'm sure there's a lot of lessons in that too that you've had to learn about being a business owner. So like, what has God taught you as a business owner, as a chiropractor?
Yeah. Well, this is actually the area of the questions that you sent me that I feel like the least qualified to speak on. But someone had told me before we opened Flourish, like, hey, just remember that if your business fails, it doesn't mean that you're a failure. Like, it can be so easy when you have, you built your business plan, you applied for loans, like you feel like you birthed this thing, for it to feel like this, yeah, just like basketball, like this is who I am, this is my identity. And so I really appreciate that advice from the start. Like, Flourish is something that's been a dream of mine, and this thing that we worked hard to produce, but it doesn't define who I am. And I think in the business world, it's so easy, and in startups, and it's just easy to think like, this is all on me. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, you have a team. And like, if Brad and I really feel like God, like we're just stewarding Flourish. Like, yeah, it's required, our initial investment, and work and time and money, but we're just stewarding it. And so it's a lot easier to feel like, hey, whatever comes in, like we can just be generous with whatever goes out, because we're just stewarding this. And if God closes up shop for us, and like, we're going to be okay. And I think COVID was a huge opportunity to just like be really open-handed with that. And it was shocking because I tend to be someone that is, oh my goodness, like, what does next quarter look like? Or, what are we going to do here or there? And how many new people are we serving and caring for? And in COVID, like, that all stops, right? And instead of worrying about how many new people are coming, it's like, how many people aren't quitting their care, because no chiropractic, you can't really do that remotely. Yeah. You like, it's an industry that you have to have your hands on people. Yeah. In contact. And so, but there was actually like so much peace in that, which was shocking, because it was just like, what, God's going to provide. And like we're just going to keep doing what we can do and only controlling what we can control. And obviously I'm sure there were times where I didn't feel as peaceful as I'm saying now, but time kind of helps smooth that over. But on the whole, it was just such a reminder that like God sustains this, and you can think that all your efforts and striving and hard work is actually what's producing the fruit.
This is like basketball.
It is. Yeah. It's just a lesson again. It's like, no, something can happen totally out of your control that shuts your hard work or striving or whatever down in a second. And so, yeah, I think for me, it's just been this renewed perspective of like, just asking God, like, God, wherever you take this, yeah, we're going to work really hard, because I think work is important. And I actually think work is a really good thing. And so I enjoy work because you can say, this is a way for me to serve the Lord. Yeah. And whether that's in a chiropractic office or whatever it is, or you're a mom at home, like not with a traditional work, but like work is good. And I think for me, it's just not getting caught up in I get to manifest the vision and goals that that we have, but these are desires of my heart and for our business and the way we could impact our community. But it's also ultimately like upon God to like see that through.
Yeah. And we were created to work, it's like from the beginning in Genesis, like that's what we're supposed to do. And people probably don't hear this all the time, but like work, like you just said, like work's a blessing. Like you love to work, but like when people associate work with like stress or like, oh, I have to do this, like I don't get to, I have to. And the fact that you've been able to have that mindset, and it's almost like I forget about COVID, like and how much of an effect that had on business owners, especially, or even with my last interview with Pastor Gerald, like starting a church, and like COVID hitting. It's almost like we all have a COVID story, like a COVID testimony too. It's like I forgot about that, which is a blessing because we're doing things like we're almost normal in a way, and like I love seeing people's faces, when I go places and stuff. I really had a hard time connecting with people when I could just see their eyes only, and it's almost like we take that for granted now. Like this is a reminder, like I'm thankful to see people's faces, and like it's the little things that we forget about. But yeah, that's so cool. And the funny thing is that like Flourish Chiropractic is doing pretty well. Like every time I go in there, it's like there's people in there, and you're supporting local businesses, and you're giving me good care, quality care, and so I just think that God has blessed you. Like He knows your attitude as far as like, this isn't my identity. Like I'm just stewarding this as a gift. And it's almost because like you have that attitude. He's like, well, okay, then I'm going to help you out then. If this was more of like, I need to keep this and steward this myself and work in my own strength, and this is my identity, and then maybe it could be taken away from you. And like that's a really humble reminder of like anything that you're doing can be taken away from you in a second, with whether that's an injury or whatever. And we take things for granted, and so I know that you have gone through trials too during the time, like as you're operating as a business owner, you've had things in your life that's happened as well, and I know this is a tough subject to talk about, but I know that you've lost your sister recently in the past couple of years, and I know that that's probably the hardest thing you've gone through in your life. And I know that it's tough, but I think it'd be really a benefit for other people to hear too, because other people have lost people as well. And how have you been processing grief, and how has God worked through that for you as well?
Yeah. I feel like this is where my thoughts kind of scatter in like a million directions. Yeah, because there's so many lessons from that. One thing, like Flourish was a huge blessing to me through that season. At times it was the only thing that really got me out of bed because I had an obligation to fulfill. And I also think that obligation is like a word that nobody likes to talk about either, but it can be a blessing to have something where it's like people depend on you, and you provide a service, and not to the point where you have to dismiss the way you're feeling, because it's good to take time to grieve and things like that. But yeah, Flourish was a blessing to me in that it gave me an outlet. Like, even though all this feels so confusing and whatever, this is something that it's like, hey, but I can just show up here and do the next thing here. And then that's a huge blessing, in that way.
And the fact that you actually had to get up and do things. Yeah. If you had the opportunity just to lay in bed, you probably maybe would have. Yeah, and is that helpful, right?
I mean, then there were seasons where I felt like, oh, if I could, just have more time. But I think in the end, it was really good thing. And that's actually after my sister passed away. So in August 2019 is when my sister passed away, like very suddenly, very tragically, no like preparation or last conversations or anything like that. I remember you brought me mums. Do you remember that? You don't? Yeah, but it was a mom, and because I hadn't seen you in a while, and then I just remember you doing that, and that meant a lot to me. But I feel like this journey with grief is also, I have like a couple notes here just because I wanted to really articulate my thoughts well, because I feel like I go through seasons where God's teaching me something about grief, and then it's like, okay, I have that, and then I move into this like new development or revelation. But I feel like just that definition of like what is good, I'm not saying that the loss of my sister was a good thing, because like I miss her every single day. There are days where I'm just like, how in the world is this reality? You just like shake your head. So losing my sister is not a good thing, but I also have faith that, God works all things for the good of those who love him. So I also have this like hopeful expectation that this horrible tragedy, like I've already seen fruit from that. So it's like you have freedom, because it's like, I know that God's going to work this for my good, and for his glory. And so it's like a beautiful, hard thing to be in, you know?
Oh, 100%. And you quoted Romans 8 right there. And like I said, it may not seem at the time like this is a good thing, because in itself, it's not, right? This is one of those things that happen in your life where I've heard people go, well, I don't want to believe in God that will let that happen, like that kind of thing. Um, it doesn't mean that he's not good. It just means that the world we live in is fallen, and we're not in heaven, right? We can watch the news for 5 minutes and figure that out real quick. And, just having to go through that is difficult, but as believers, we have hope. Like, oh, praise the Lord. Like, we have hope that this isn't the last time you're going to see her, even. That's the beauty. It's like our worst enemy, which is death. Jesus has defeated that. That's why we can walk in victory, right? Like, that's honestly one of the inspirations of the show name, because I see Christians too that maybe walk around in defeat, maybe fellow brothers or sisters in Christ, and I hate that, and I know that we're called to walk in victory despite our circumstances. Is it 1 Thessalonians 5:16? Rejoice always, give thanks in all circumstances, and pray without ceasing. Maybe it's not in that order, but that's one of my favorite verses, because it just shows that we have, no matter what the circumstances are in our life, we have hope in Jesus, because the Bible says we're all going to be raised up again with perfect bodies, and we're all going to be with him in a place of perfection, and where there is no pain, there is no death, no sickness or tears, right? We're talking Revelation, but that is our hope, and that is why we can have hope in the midst of trials. If we didn't, if death was the last thing and that was the answer, like in the end, then, well, we might as well just live it up as best we can while we have it, we have life. But there's so much joy and hope knowing that there's more, and I know that helps you in processing what's going on, that you're going to be processing for the rest of your life, in some ways. But there's beauty in it too. Like you said, there's beauty in the struggle, and beauty in being honest and open with God, like how David was, like he was so honest in the Psalms of, my enemies are around me, like, or where are you? And, just his sin and the honesty of him. And it's like, God cares for us so much that we're allowed to be honest with him, even in things like, you can ask those questions of like, why did you let that happen? And that's okay. He wants to walk with us in that. And so you're still processing things. I know.
Yeah. And I think that those are like game changer, those types of situations, loss or just total disappointment or whatever it might be. It is an opportunity where I can see, how people go the other way. Like, God, that was, like, I don't want anything to do with that, because I think we've also been sold in veins of Christianity, like, hey, when you're a Christian, like, it is made to be well, like with my soul. But that doesn't mean that there's not the reality of the world. But for me, I truly don't know how people process grief and loss and those things apart from Christ, because that is despair. I don't, that's the only, and then some people will say like, oh, religion is just a coping mechanism, where I'm like, well, it's a balm to your soul. And so I don't know how people can journey through those experiences without that. But I've read so many really helpful things, obviously the Bible, and you had already brought up James, but trials it's hard to say, but a gift, like that, the steadfastness that produces. And I hate to even speak it out loud, but like, I have confidence that one day, when my parents pass away or my, whatever comes, like, I know that I'm going to be okay. Like, God's going to be with me. I've already faced that trial and can just have this confidence that, like, hey, when everything is stripped away, like God's still going to be there. And I don't want to say that flippantly because different situations, I'm sure would, bring different types of feelings. But I know that I can stand on the truth that like I face something unimaginable and there's still goodness, like, and joy. And it doesn't mean that's not hard and sad and frustrating, but I think there's freedom as well, just to be like, hey, like God's with me, even when it feels like things are crumbling.
Yeah. And it's like, well, you said coping mechanism, right? Like we see what people do when they're in despair. They do, if they don't go to God for a coping mechanism per se, they'll go to the bottle, or they'll go to drugs or sex or money or whatever that may be. And any time that, even I've done that in the past before I was a Christian, I can't sit there and say, oh yeah, I feel a lot better after that. Like I feel just like whole and new and full of joy. It was only for a temporary time that I felt okay, if I was going through something. And so,
yeah, and I'm not saying that I'm using that as a coping, because the peace that you have is not it's more than that.
It's a hope, a living hope.
Yeah. But I've gotten into a lot of Christian authors, and I love Elisabeth Elliot, if you've never read any of her stuff, but her husband was martyred by these Alca Indians, and I think it was the 50s, but she has a book called Suffering is Never for Nothing. And that was just huge. She talked about like our suffering has a purpose. And obviously, there's so many different forms of suffering. But one reason or one fruit of suffering is just that we know God more and deeper. So it's like when you're in those trials, you can know the character of God in a new way. And then also that we can form obedience, because maybe you don't feel like doing this or that amidst your sufferings, or it's really easy when you're suffering for your mind to go down all of these holes. Like I can remember just like wanting to fixate on, I went to a really great Christian grief counselor. So I am a huge proponent of that, just processing, because your brain like wants to make sense of a situation, and our brain doesn't always do that properly, but it's like you want to fixate on maybe certain details. Or I can remember like at an anniversary of her loss, it's like I kind of forget like what her voice sounds like. And that can be something that's like, what am I gonna forget at 10 years, And it's like, why am I being disobedient and worrying about tomorrow? Like, why? You know what I mean? So you can also learn obedience. Like, God tells me not to worry about tomorrow, so why am I anxious about like the things I'm going to forget in 9 years? Like, that's just silly, but that's what your brain can do. And so it's an opportunity to like be obedient.
Yeah, it's a constant, we need to be renewed in our mind. It's like the feeling thing, right? We feel like we should be anxious, but obviously God says, don't be anxious for anything. Like today already has enough problems. Don't worry about tomorrow too, because it doesn't add to your life. It's not going to help anything or anybody around you. Yet it's the first thing that we want to do, but as we grow and learn develop a relationship with Jesus, we realize that he's in control, and this is a beautiful thing too. It's like God himself knows what pain and grief and loss feels like. Isn't that amazing that Jesus himself experienced all those things and was humiliated on the cross, and it's like God can sympathize with all of us because he's been in our shoes. He's literally been incarnate in flesh, like us. And he is able to sympathize with us in even the worst pain that we have, because he knows what it feels like. And so, I commend you just for continuing to, lead your business well and go and care for other people in the midst of that, even though you needed that care too. And you did the smart thing, right? You actually went and you got that care, which was crucial. And it made you have to wake up every morning and go help other people. And as hard as that was to do, you still did it. And there was it was a good thing that you had to do that, right? Because if you didn't, like we said earlier, you maybe would stay home and and focus and think why. And I always tell that to people too. It's like, if you're feeling upset or down, go help somebody else out and see what happens. Because it happens to me all the time when I go to the Dream Center. Like, maybe I'll have like a bad day, or I'll be in my head, and I'll go there and I'll listen to someone else in their pain, and I'll see that I don't have it that bad. I'm not homeless. I have a lot of things to be thankful for. And so the cure for depression or anything like that would be the Lord and thankfulness. I always ask people that when they're down and they're focused on all the bad things. I'm like, okay, well, tell me like 3 things that you're thankful for. And I work as a physical therapy assistant, right? And I do home health. And, I actually have a lot of people right now in the Hilltop area where it is like low income and poverty, all that kind of thing. And I had a guy who was very down. And I asked him that. I said, what are you thankful for? No, he said, nothing. And I said, well, you're breathing, right? And he said, I'm not even thankful for that. And it just shows you like how low you can get, and it's like, we can't have that. We have to go to Jesus, and it's okay to feel down, but we need to be intentional, even in the midst of our pain, to get help, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And then Elisabeth Elliot also says our suffering develops trust in God. And I think that's kind of what I was saying. Like, I trust that God will show up for me in whatever comes in. And then another thing with suffering is like the fruit of that. And I think a fruit of the loss that I've experienced is just such a reminder that how fleeting life is. And so it's helped me, like, when I do interact with people, I really try to think, and I'm not perfect at it, but like, hey, this essentially, and I don't want to be morbid, but like, this might be the last meaningful conversation that I get to have. And so I want to be really intentional about that. And so like, I already see fruit from a really hard and difficult season that, yeah, like you said, I'm not ever going to get over this grief. And it's not something to fix. It's just something to like grow and steward.
Yeah. And yeah, it's just good that I don't have those thoughts as much, right? Of like, but I need to, of like, when I have a conversation with somebody, thinking, I better cherish this. I don't know even if I'm going to be around tomorrow, right? Let alone them.
But I don't think it needs to like this weight of pressure or like, oh man, was that like worthy of our, but it's more of just like seeing people and thinking like, 1, I don't know what they're going through. And then 2, like, I want to at least let them know that like, I've seen them, I care about them.
Yeah. It makes you think. Yeah. It definitely makes you think. And like, you're making me think, which is great. It's like, yeah, that's so true. We need to cherish the time we have with each other, for sure. I have a question. Is there any piece of advice you can give our listeners on how to walk in victory, from a Christian perspective? And I think we've kind of been talking about it, but like, is there anything like you can think of about whoever's just listening, like in general with their Christian life, how can they walk in victory more with Jesus?
Mm-hmm. I feel like that's also really hard. There's like a million things, but aside from developing your spiritual disciplines, which like there's things in the spiritual disciplines that I like really, God's working on me to do more. But I think that something that is a theme throughout my life is just being in community. And I feel like that's a big thing. Like when I went through the loss, like just having people to not feel like I had to do that on my own. Like people came into my life that had been more on the periphery, but I maybe experienced something similar, who just like really showed up or dropped a note in the mail. And it's just to have, one, you have to foster community before you're in those trials.
You start picking up the phone, calling everybody. Hey, I need somebody.
Yeah. So not like, hey, do community so that when your life is horrible, like you have people. No, it's like you want to be there for them and vice versa. But I think that I grew up where family was like the most important thing. And I'm really grateful for that because like the bonds that I have with my brother or had with my sister and my parents, like it's just so special. But we maybe took the pendulum to exclude like the joy of authentic friendship outside the home. Not that we didn't have friends, but it was like blood thicker than water, all these things. And it's like, yeah, but like we have brothers and sisters in Christ. And so it's great to invite them into our life as well. And so I think that would be something where like it's so easy just to feel like you have to go at it alone. But it's like there are people that would love you to be vulnerable and invite you in like you did. Maybe not the one guy that heard your story, your message last night, but I'm sure there were other people that were edified and thought like, I'm really grateful that he shared that because now I can like have freedom to maybe share that with someone else. So I think in a world where it's easy to be connected, but not actually like have those deep relationships, that would be my thing. Like just be vulnerable and put yourself out there. And like sometimes it's awkward, like when you're making those initial, I have a friend that I'm friends with that it was like, I had to work really hard because we both wanted to have that community, but we were also like just kind of awkward. But years down the road, it's like, wow, I'm really grateful that we pursued that and stuck with it.
That's such a good word. I think that community is so crucial. Like it is. We cannot do it on our own. Like period. Like we may be able to do a few things well on our own, but like when it's all said and done, like God made us for community because you know what? He is community. He's Trinity. He is Father, Son, Holy Spirit. He himself is community. Therefore, we're made in his image, and therefore we desire community. So it's not a mistake that we want to be around people, and that when we're isolated for long periods of time, that's detrimental to our mental health, right? And so that is such a good piece of advice, and that's something that I've really appreciated becoming a Christian because, I had the boys, from back home that was great and a great community, but we were doing things for the wrong reasons, But I remember when I first came to like a Bible study for the first time, I had my friend Andrew just come over to me after I kind of shared my story and where I was. I was very confused at the time of like, I just started reading the Bible. This doesn't make sense to me, but what you guys are saying, like I'm trying to process. And he just came up to me and he said, if you ever want to go out and eat lunch and hang out, let me know. And I did. And when I was going through the hard time I was going through as far as like just I lost my identity when I became a Christian because everything I used to do, I had to switch up because God was calling me to something better. But it didn't make sense to me. And so I had a lot of questions. And if I were just to sit there by myself, I wouldn't get very far, And so I was so thankful to be invited into that community by people who really cared, and they would call themselves Christians, and they actually lived it out, And that was a blessing for me. And now I try to do the same for others because I know how much that meant for me to like invite, like tonight, for example, we're literally having a men's night at my house with my roommate, and we're inviting people in, and I'm inviting friends in who maybe have struggles too that we're all going to talk about tonight, and we're all going to just have a good time, play games, and eat food. But it's like that stuff means a lot, and I'm so thankful for it. We need community. That's one way to walk in victory.
Yeah. And I think too, sometimes in Christian circles, like we always want to be the one invited, like almost this expectation of my church has to provide these offerings, or why have they not initiated? But also just like being prayerful about who could I connect with, more of like who's God calling me to community with, or just an offer. I started a grief gathering at our church just because around the holidays I was like, around holidays or whatever, it's like sometimes you just get this like, and it's like if I'm feeling this way, like I know that there are other people in my church of 400 that probably have the same tug right now. Yeah. Like, and maybe not the same situation, but so I'm just gonna like put it out there. And thankfully I had the platform to ask my pastor, like, hey, I'd like to start a grief gathering. Could I put, and it's just amazing to like the people that come out of the woodwork that are just like, I needed this, but I didn't want to come because my husband died 5 years ago and I thought it'd be weird if I showed up. And it's like, no, why would you think that? Because you're still on that journey. But yeah, also just not feeling like that there has to be an opportunity on a silver platter. Like maybe you are being called to initiate and throw out community, and maybe only one person comes, but I'm sure. Yeah.
If you could even help one person in community, you've done your job. Like, it's not even like when it comes to sharing the gospel too, it's like, it's not my my responsibility to change people. Even if one person doesn't get changed, your job is to be faithful and proclaim, the gospel. And our job is just to be faithful with what we have, and whatever city he's putting us in at this time, with the people we work with at that time, those are the people that we have responsibility to go and reach out to. And you're right, it's like, that's life too at times. You just can't wait for things to happen. And especially for singles too, like anyone who's single listening, it's like, you do, especially as a man, you definitely need to initiate, right? Because if you just sit there and expect a silver platter to come upon, God does provide, but it's like, God also calls us to be bold and to reach out to people. And it may feel uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. And you don't have to have all the answers. And
exactly.
Yeah.
And it will feel uncomfortable, but that's the point. Like, the more you strengthen like, even as a muscle, the more you exercise your muscle, you tear it, and it's uncomfortable, but then it grows back stronger. Like, there's a lesson even in exercise that God is trying to show us, that it's okay to feel uncomfortable, to embrace that uncomfortability, and to go for it anyway, because that's when God works. Like, I think about Peter taking a step out the boat on the water. I'm sure that was very uncomfortable, but he had faith, and he said, I want to follow you, Jesus. I want to take a step out I can't do this on my own. I can't walk on water by myself, but through God, all things are possible. And so that's just a really good word. That's a really good word of encouragement, of community. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think that was really good conversation. Is there any lasting words that you have, or I think that's probably good.
Yeah, I appreciate you asking me, because this was a step outside of my comfort zone.
Oh, you were uncomfortable. How about that? And even for me, it's still uncomfortable. Like, oh, I'm in front of a camera. Oh, I have a mic in front of me. Like,
and I have the pleasure of having like some prompts, and you're the one that's having to respond like just to whatever I say.
Sure, it's a conversation. It's a conversation, and it's because I was uncomfortable and I took a step out and did this podcast. Like, I'm sure even just one person that hears this, it's going to help them in some way, and that's a blessing. So with that, thank you for watching Walking in Victory. If you're watching on YouTube, please, like and subscribe. That means a lot to me. And if you're listening on a podcast, please give a rating and review. And if you're feeling generous, my Patreon is also in the links in the description as well. And so just appreciate all that. And I have appreciated the support that I've gotten so far from friends and family. So thanks for listening to Walk in Victory, and I hope you have a good day.